Prince. 1972. On the banks of the mighty Columbia River, in this icy season, when every breath became visible, the orchard called Belle Noche was quiet. Dormant apple trees stretched as far as the eye could see, their sturdy roots coiled deep in the cold, fertile soil. As temperatures plummeted and color drained from land and sky, the whitened landscape caused a kind of winter blindness. One day became indistinguishable from the next. Everything froze, turned fragile. Nowhere were the cold and quiet more noticeable than in Meredith Whitson's own house. At 12, she had already discovered the empty spaces that gathered between people. She longed for her family to be like those she saw on television, where everything looked perfect and everyone got along. No one, not even her beloved father, understood how alone she often felt within these four walls. How invisible. But tomorrow night, all of that would change. She had come up with a brilliant plan. She had written a play based on one of her mother's fairy tales, and she would present it at the annual Christmas party. It was exactly the kind of thing that would happen on an episode of The Partridge Family. "How come I can't be the star?" Nina whined. It was at least the 10th time she'd asked this question since Meredith had finished the script. Meredith turned around in her chair and looked down at her 9-year-old sister, who was crouched on the wooden floor of their bedroom, painting a mint-green castle on an old bedsheet. Meredith bit her lower lip, trying not to frown. The castle was too messy, not right at all. "Do we have to talk about this again, Nina?" "But why can't I be the peasant girl who marries the prince?" "You know why. Jeff is playing the prince and he's 13. You'd look silly next to him." Nina put her paintbrush in the empty soup can and sat back on her heels. With her short black hair, bright green eyes, and pale skin, she looked like a perfect little pixie. "Can I be the peasant girl next year?" "You bet." Meredith grinned. She loved the idea that she might be creating a family tradition. All of her friends had traditions, but not the Whitsons. They had always been different. There was no stream of relatives who came to their house on holidays, no turkey on Thanksgiving or ham on Easter, no prayers that were always said. Heck, they didn't even know for sure how old their mom was. It was because Mom was Russian and alone in this country. Or at least that was what Dad said. Mom didn't say much of anything about herself. A knock at the door surprised Meredith. She looked up just as Jeff Cooper and her father came into the room. Meredith felt like one of those long, floppy balloons being slowly filled with air, taking on a new form with each breath. And in this case, the breath was Jeffrey Cooper. They'd been best friends since 4th grade, but lately it felt different to be around him. Exciting. Sometimes, when he looked at her, she could barely breathe. "You're right on time for rehearsal." He gave her one of his heart-stopping smiles. "Just don't tell Joey and the guys. They'd give me a ton of crap for this." "About rehearsal," her dad said, stepping forward. He was still in his work clothes, a brown leisure suit with orange top stitching. Surprisingly, there was no smile lurking beneath his bushy black mustache or in his eyes. He held out the script. "This is the play you're doing?" Meredith rose from the chair. "Do you think she'll like it?" Nina stood up. Her heart-shaped face was uncharacteristically solemn. "Will she?" The three of them looked at one another over the expanse of the Picasso-style green castle and the costumes laid out across the bed. The truth they passed among themselves, in looks alone, was that Anya Whitson was a cold woman. Any warmth she had was directed at her husband. Precious little of it reached her daughters. When they were younger, Dad had tried to pretend it was otherwise, to redirect their attention like a magician, mesmerizing them with the brightness of his affection. But as with all illusions, the truth ultimately appeared behind it. So they all knew what Meredith was asking. "I don't know, Meridoodle," Dad said, reaching into his pocket for his cigarettes. "Your mother's stories—" "I love it when she tells them," Meredith said. "It's the only time she really talks to us," Nina added. Dad lit a cigarette and stared at them through a swirl of gray smoke. His brown eyes narrowed. "Yeah," he said, exhaling. "It's just—" Meredith moved toward him, careful not to step on the painting. She understood his hesitation. None of them ever really knew what would set Mom off, but this time Meredith was sure she had the answer. If there was one thing her mother loved, it was this fairy tale about a reckless peasant girl who dared to fall in love with the prince. "It only takes 10 minutes, Dad. I timed it. Everyone will love it." "Okay, then," he said finally. She felt a swell of pride and hope. For once she wouldn't spend the party in some shadowy corner of the living room reading, or in the kitchen washing dishes. Instead, she would be the center of her mother's attention. This play would prove that Meredith had listened to every precious word Mom had ever said, even those few that were spoken softly in the dark at story time. For the next hour, Meredith directed her actors through the play, although really only Jeff needed help. She and Nina had heard this fairy tale for years. Later, when the rehearsal was over and everyone had gone their separate ways, Meredith kept working. She made a sign that read, "One night only, a grand play for the holiday," and listed their 3 names. She touched up the painted backdrop. It was impossible to fix entirely. Nina always colored outside of the lines, and then positioned it in the living room. When the set was ready, she added sequins to the tulle ballet skirt turned princess gown that she would wear at the end. It was nearly 2 a.m. by the time she went to bed, and even then she was so excited that it took a long time for her to fall asleep. The next day seemed to pass slowly, but finally, at 6 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. It was not a big crowd, just the usual people. Men and women who worked for the orchard and their families, a few neighbors, and Dad's only living relative, his sister Dora. Meredith sat at the top of the stairs, staring down at the entryway below. She couldn't help tapping her foot on the step, wondering when she could make her move. Just as she was about to stand up, she heard a clanging, rattling sound. Oh, no! She shot to her feet and rushed down the stairs, but it was too late. Nina was in the kitchen, banging a pot with a metal spoon and yelling out, "Showtime!" No one knew how to steal the limelight like Nina. There was a smattering of laughter as the guests made their way from the kitchen to the living room, where the painting of the castle hung from an aluminum movie screen set up beside the massive fireplace. To the right was a large Christmas tree, decorated with drugstore lights and ornaments Nina and Meredith had made over the years. In front of the painting was their stage, a small wooden bridge that rested on the hardwood floor, and a street lamp made from cardboard with the flashlight duct taped to the top. Meredith dimmed the lights in the room, turned on the flashlight, and then ducked behind the painted backdrop. Nina and Jeff were already there in their costumes. There was only a little privacy back here. If she leaned sideways, she could see several of the guests, and they could see her, but still it felt separate. When the room quieted, Meredith took a deep breath and began the narration she'd composed so painstakingly. Her name is Vera, and she is a poor peasant girl, a nobody. She lives in a magical realm called the Snow Kingdom, but her beloved world is dying, and evil has come to this land. It rolls across the cobblestone streets in black carriages sent by a dark, evil knight who wants to destroy it all. Meredith made her entrance, taking care not to trip over her long, layered skirts as she took the stage. She looked out over the guests and saw her mother in the back of the room, alone somehow, even in this crowd, her beautiful face blurred by cigarette smoke. For once, she was looking directly at Meredith. "Come, sister," Meredith said loudly, moving toward the street lamp. "We shall not let this cold stop us." Nina stepped out from behind the curtain. Dressed in a ratty nightgown with a kerchief covering her hair, she wrung her hands together and looked up at Meredith. "Do you think it is the Black Knight?" she yelled, drawing a laugh from the crowd. "Is his bad magic making it so cold?" "No," No, I am chilled at the loss of our father. When will he return? Meredith pressed the back of her hand to her forehead and sighed dramatically. The carriages are everywhere these days. The Black Night is gaining power. People are turning to smoke before our eyes. Look, Nina said, pointing toward the painted castle. It is the prince. She managed to sound reverent. Jeff moved into place on their little stage. In his blue sport coat and jeans, with a cheap gold crown on his wheat blonde hair, he looked so handsome that for a moment Meredith couldn't remember her lines. She knew he was embarrassed and uncomfortable. The red in his cheeks made that obvious. But still he was here, proving what a good friend he was. And he was smiling at her as if she really were a princess. He held out a pair of silk roses. I have 2 roses for you, he said to Meredith, his voice cracking. She touched his hand, but before she could say her line, there was a loud crash. Meredith turned, saw her mother standing in the center of the crowd, motionless, her face pale, her blue eyes blazing. Blood dripped from her hand. She'd broken her cocktail glass, and even from here Meredith could see a shard sticking out of her mother's palm. Enough, her mother said sharply. This is hardly entertainment for a party. The guests didn't know what to do. Some stood up. Others remained seated. The room went quiet. Dad made his way to Mom. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, or he tried to. She wouldn't bend, not even for him. I never should have told you those ridiculous fairy tales, Mom said, her Russian accent sharp with anger. I forgot how romantic and empty-headed girls can be. Meredith was so humiliated she couldn't move. She saw her father guide her mother into the kitchen, where he probably took her straight to the sink and began cleaning up her hand. The guests left as if this were the Titanic and they were rushing for lifeboats stationed just beyond the front door. Only Jeff looked at Meredith, and she could see how embarrassed he was for her. He started toward her, still holding the 2 roses. Meredith, she pushed past him and ran out of the room. At the end of the hall, in a shadowy corner, she skidded to a stop and stood there, breathing hard, her eyes burning with tears. She could hear her dad's voice coming from the kitchen. He was trying to soothe his angry wife. A minute later, a door clicked shut, and she knew that Jeff had gone home. What did you do? Nina asked quietly, coming up beside her. Who knows? Meredith said, wiping her eyes. She's such a bitch. That's a bad word. Meredith heard the trembling in Nina's voice and knew how hard her sister was trying not to cry. She reached down and held her hand. What do we do? Should we say we're sorry? Meredith couldn't help thinking about the last time she'd made her mother mad and told her she was sorry. She won't care. Trust me. So what do we do? Meredith tried to feel as mature as she had this morning, but her confidence was gone. She knew what would happen. Dad would calm Mom down, and then he'd come up to their room and make them laugh and hold them in his big, strong arms and tell them that Mom really loved them. By the time he was done with the jokes and the stories, Meredith would want desperately to believe it. Again. "I know what I'm going to do," she said, moving through the entryway toward the kitchen until she could see Mom's side. Just her slim black velvet dress and her pale arm and her white hair. "I'm never going to listen to her stupid fairy tales again." We don't know how to say goodbye. We wander on, shoulder to shoulder. Already the sun is going down. You're moody. I am your shadow. Anna Akhmatova. From Poems of Akhmatova, translated by Stanley Kunitz with Max Hayward. 1. 2000. Was this what 40 looked like? Really? In the past year, Meredith had gone from Miss to Ma'am, just like that, with no transition. Even worse, her skin had begun to lose its elasticity. There were tiny pleats in places that used to be smooth. Her neck was fuller. There was no doubt about it. She hadn't gone gray yet. That was the one saving grace. Her chestnut-colored hair, cut in a no-nonsense shoulder-length bob, was still full and shiny. But her eyes gave her away. She looked tired, and not only at 6 in the morning. She turned away from the mirror and stripped out of her old t-shirt and into a pair of black sweats, anklet socks, and a long-sleeved black shirt. Pulling her hair into a stumpy ponytail, she left the bathroom and walked into her darkened bedroom, where the soft strains of her husband's snoring made her almost want to crawl back into bed. In the old days, she would have done just that, would have snuggled up against him. Leaving the room, she clicked the door shut behind her and headed down the hallway toward the stairs. In the pale glow of a pair of long outdated nightlights, she passed the closed doors of her children's bedrooms. Not that they were children anymore. Jillian was 19 now, a sophomore at UCLA who dreamed of being a doctor. And Maddie, Meredith's baby, was 18 and a freshman at Vanderbilt. Without them, this house and Meredith's life felt emptier and quieter than she'd expected. For nearly 20 years, she had devoted herself to being the kind of mother she hadn't had, and it had worked. She and her daughters had become the best of friends. Their absence left her feeling adrift, a little purposeless. She knew it was silly. It wasn't as if she didn't have plenty to do. She just missed the girls. That was all. She kept moving. Lately, that seemed to be the best way to handle things. Downstairs, she stopped in the living room just long enough to plug in the Christmas tree lights. In the mudroom, the dogs leaped up at her, yapping and wagging their tails. "Luke! Leia, no jumping!" she scolded the huskies, scratching their ears as she led them to the back door. When she opened it, cold air rushed in. Snow had fallen again last night, and though it was still dark on this mid-December morning, she could make out the pale pearlescence of road and field. Her breath turned into vapory plumes. By the time they were all outside and on their way, it was 6:10, and the sky was a deep purplish gray. Right on time. Meredith ran slowly at first, acclimating herself to the cold. As she did every weekday morning, she ran along the gravel road that led from her house, down past her parents' house, and out to the old single-lane road that ended about a mile up the hill. From there, she followed the loop out to the golf course and back. 4 miles exactly. It was a routine she rarely missed. She had no choice, really. Everything about Meredith was big by nature. She was tall, with broad shoulders, curvy hips, and big feet. Even her features seemed just a little too much for her pale oval face. She had a big Julia Roberts-type mouth, huge brown eyes, full eyebrows, and thick hair. Only constant exercise, a vigilant diet, good hair products, and an industrial-sized pair of tweezers could keep her looking good. As she turned back onto her road, the rising sun illuminated the mountains, turned their snow-capped peaks lavender and pink. On either side of her, thousands of bare, spindly apple trees showed through the snow like brown stitches on white fabric. This fertile cleft of land had belonged to their family for 50 years, and there, in the center of it all, tall and proud, was the home in which she'd grown up. Bella Noche. Even in the half-light, it looked ridiculously out of place and ostentatious. Meredith kept running up the hill, faster and faster, until she could barely breathe and there was a stitch in her side. She came to a stop at her own front porch as the valley filled with bright golden light. She fed the dogs and then hurried upstairs. She was just going into the bathroom as Jeff was coming out. Wearing only a towel, with his graying blonde hair still dripping wet, he turned sideways to let her pass, and she did the same. Neither one of them spoke. By 7:20, she was drying her hair, and by 7:30, right on time, she was dressed for work in a pair of black jeans and a fitted green blouse. A little eyeliner, some blush and mascara, a coat of lipstick, and she was ready to go. Downstairs, she found Jeff at the kitchen table, sitting in his regular chair, reading the New York Times. The dogs were asleep at his feet. She went to the coffee pot and poured herself a cup. "You need a refill?" "I'm good," he said without looking up. Meredith stirred soy milk into her coffee, watching the color change. It occurred to her that she and Jeff only talked at a distance lately, like strangers or disillusioned partners, and only about work or the kids. She tried idly to remember the last time they'd made love, and couldn't. Maybe that was normal. Certainly it was. When you'd been married as long as they had, there were bound to be quiet times. Still, it saddened her sometimes to remember how passionate they used to be. She'd been 14 on their first date. They'd gone to see Young Frankenstein. It was still one of their favorites. And to be honest, that was the last time she'd ever really looked at another guy. It was strange when she thought about that now. She didn't consider herself a romantic woman, but she'd fallen in love practically at first sight. He'd been a part of her for as long as she could remember. They'd married early, too early, really, and she'd followed him to college in Seattle, working nights and weekends in smoky bars to pay tuition. She'd been happy in their cramped, tiny U-District apartment. Then, when they were seniors, she'd gotten pregnant. It had terrified her at first. She'd worried that she was like her mother, and that parenthood wouldn't be a good thing. But she discovered, to her profound relief, that she was the complete opposite of her own mother. Perhaps her youth had helped in that. God knew Mom had not been young when Meredith was born. Jeff shook his head. It was a minute gesture, barely even a movement, but she saw it. She had always been attuned to him, and lately their mutual disappointments seemed to create sound, like a high-pitched whistle that only she could hear. "What?" she said. "Nothing." "You didn't shake your head over nothing. What's the matter?" "I just asked you something." "I didn't hear you. Ask me again." "It doesn't matter." "Fine." She took her coffee and headed toward the dining room. It was something she'd done 100 times, and yet just then, as she passed under the old-fashioned ceiling light with its useless bit of plastic mistletoe, her view changed. She saw herself as if from a distance. A 40-year-old woman holding a cup of coffee, looking at 2 empty places at the table, and at the husband who was still here. And for a split second, she wondered what other life that woman could have lived. What if she hadn't come home to run the orchard and raise her children? What if she hadn't gotten married so young? What kind of woman could she have become? And then it was gone like a soap bubble, and she was back where she belonged. "Will you be home for dinner?" "Aren't I always?" 7 o'clock, she said. "By all means," he said, turning the page. "Let's set a time." Meredith was at her desk by 8 o'clock. As usual, she was the first to arrive, and went about the cubicle-divided space on the warehouse's second floor, flipping on lights. She passed by her dad's office, empty now, pausing only long enough to glance at the plaques by his door. 13 times he'd been voted Grower of the Year, and his advice was still sought out by competitors on a regular basis. It didn't matter that he only occasionally came into the office, or that he'd been semi-retired for 10 years. He was still the face of the Belle Noci orchard, the man who had pioneered golden delicious apples in the early 60s, Granny Smiths in the 70s, and championed the Braeburn and Fuji in the 90s. His designs for cold storage had revolutionized the business and helped make it possible to export the very best apples to world markets. She had had a part to play in the company's growth and success, to be sure. Under her leadership, the cold storage warehouse had been expanded, and a big part of their business was now storing fruit for other growers. She'd turned the old roadside apple stand into a gift shop that sold hundreds of locally made craft items, specialty foods, and Belle Noci memorabilia. At this time of year, the holidays, when trainloads of tourists arrived in Leavenworth for the world-famous tree-lighting ceremony, more than a few found their way to the gift shop. The first thing she did was pick up the phone to call her youngest daughter. It was just past 10 in Tennessee. "Hello?" Mattie grumbled. "Good morning," Meredith said brightly. "It sounds like someone slept in." "Oh, Mom. Hi. I was up late last night, studying." "Madison Elizabeth," was all Meredith had to say to make her point. Mattie sighed. "Okay, so it was a Lambda Chi party. I know how fun it all is, and how much you want to experience every moment of college, but your first final is next week. Tuesday morning, right?" "Right. You have to learn to balance schoolwork and fun. So get your lily-white ass out of bed and get to class. It's a life skill, partying all night and still getting up on time. The world won't end if I miss one Spanish class." "Madison?" Mattie laughed. Okay, I'm getting up. Spanish 101, here I come. Hasta la vista, baby." Meredith smiled. "I'll call on Thursday and find out how your speech went. And call your sister. She's stressed out about her organic chemistry test." "Okay, Mom. I love you." "Love you too, Princess." Meredith hung up the phone, feeling better. For the next 3 hours, she threw herself into work. She was rereading the latest crop report when her intercom buzzed. "Meredith, your dad is on line 1. "Thanks, Daisy." She picked up the call. "Hi, Dad. Mom and I were wondering if you could come to the house for lunch today. I'm swamped here, Dad. Please." Meredith had never been able to deny her father. "Okay, but I have to be back by 1. "Excellent," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. She hung up and went back to work. Lately, with production up and demand down, and costs for both export and transportation skyrocketing, she often spent her days putting out one fire after another, and today was no exception. By noon, a low-grade stress headache had crawled into the space at the base of her skull and begun to growl. Still, she smiled at her employees as she left her office and walked through the cold warehouse. In less than 10 minutes, she pulled up in front of her parents' garage. The house was like something out of a Russian fairy tale, with its turret-like 2-story veranda and elaborate fretwork trim, especially this time of year, when the eaves and railings glittered with Christmas lights. The hammered copper roof was dulled today by the gray winter weather, but on a bright day it shone like liquid gold. Surrounded by tall, elegant poplar trees and situated on a gentle rise that overlooked their valley, this house was so famous that tourists often stopped to photograph it. Leave it to her mother to build something so absurdly out of place. A Russian dacha, or summer house, in western Washington state. Even the orchard's name was absurd. Belje Noci. White nights indeed. The nights here were as dark as new asphalt. Not that Mom cared about what was around her. She got her way, that was all. Whatever Anya Whitson wanted, her husband gave to her. And apparently she'd wanted a fairy tale castle and an orchard with an unpronounceable Russian name. Meredith knocked and went inside. The kitchen was empty. A big pot of soup simmered on the stove. In the living room, light spilled through the 2-story rounded wall of windows at the north end of the room, the famous Belje Noci turret. Wood floors gleamed with the golden beeswax that Mom insisted on using, even though it turned the floors into a skating rink if you dared to walk in stockinged feet. A huge stone fireplace dominated the center wall. Clustered around it was a grouping of richly upholstered antique sofas and chairs. Above the fireplace hung an oil painting of a Russian troika, a romantic-looking carriage drawn by matching horses sailing through a field of snow. Pure Dr. Zhivago. To her left were dozens of pictures of Russian churches, and below them was her mother's holy corner, where a table held a display of antique icons and a single candle that burned year-round. She found her father in the back of the room, alongside the heavily decorated Christmas tree, in his favorite spot. He lay stretched out on the burgundy mohair cushions of the ottoman bed, reading. His hair, what he had left of it at 85, stuck out from his pink scalp in white tufts. Too many decades in the sun had blotched and pleated his skin, and he had a basset hound look even when he was smiling. But the sad countenance fooled no one. Everyone loved Evan Whitson. It was impossible not to. At her entrance, his face lit up. He reached out and squeezed her hand tightly, then let go. "Your mom will be so glad to see you." Meredith smiled. It was the game they'd played for years. Dad pretended that Mom loved Meredith, and Meredith pretended to believe him. "Great. Is she upstairs?" "I couldn't keep her out of the garden this morning." Meredith wasn't surprised. "I'll get her." She left her father in the living room and walked through the kitchen to the formal dining room. Through the French doors, she saw an expanse of snow-covered ground, with acres of dormant apple trees in the distance. Closer, beneath the icicle-draped branches of a 50-year-old magnolia tree, was a small rectangular garden defined by antique wrought-iron fencing. Its ornate gate was twined with brown vines. Come summer, that gate would be a profusion of green leaves and white flowers. Now it glittered with frost. And there she was. Her 80-something-year-old mother, bundled up in blankets, sitting on the black bench in her so-called winter garden. A light snow began to fall. Tiny flakes blurred the scene into an impressionistic painting where nothing looked solid enough to touch. Sculpted bushes and a single bird bath were covered in snow, giving the garden a strange, otherworldly look. Not surprisingly, her mother sat in the middle of it all, motionless, her hands clasped in her lap. As a child, it had scared Meredith, all that solitude in her mother. But as she got older, it had begun to embarrass, then irritate her. A woman of her mother's age had no business sitting alone in the cold. Her mother claimed it was because of her ruined vision, but Meredith didn't believe that. It was true that her mother's eyes didn't process color. She saw only white and black and shades of gray. But that had never struck Meredith, even as a girl, as a reason for staring at nothing. She opened the door and went out into the cold. Her boots sank in the ankle-deep snow. Here and there, crusty patches crunched underneath, and more than once she almost slipped. "You shouldn't be out here, Mom," she said, coming up beside her. "You'll catch pneumonia." "It takes more cold than this to give me pneumonia. This is barely below freezing." Meredith rolled her eyes. It was the sort of ridiculous comment her mother always made. "I've only got an hour for lunch, so you'd better come in now." Her voice sounded sharp in the softness of the falling snow, and she winced, wishing she had rounded her vowels more, tempered her voice. What was it about her mother that brought out the worst in her? "Did you know he invited me for lunch?" "Of course," her mother said, but Meredith heard the lie in it. Her mother rose from the bench in a single fluid motion, like some ancient goddess used to being revered and adored. Her face was remarkably smooth and wrinkle-free, her skin flawless and almost translucent. She had the kind of bone structure that made other women envious. But it was her eyes that defined her beauty. Deep-set and fringed by thick lashes, they were a remarkable shade of aqua flecked with bits of gold. Meredith was sure that no one who had seen those eyes ever forgot them. How ironic it was that eyes of such remarkable hue were unable to see color. Meredith took her mother's elbow and led her away from the bench. Only then, when they were walking, did she notice that her mother's hands were bare and turning blue. "Good God! Your hands are blue! You should have on gloves in this cold." "You do not know cold." "Whatever, Mom." Meredith bustled her mother up the back steps and into the warmth of the house. "Maybe you should take a bath to warm up." "I do not want to be warm, thank you. It is December 14th. "Fine," Meredith said, watching her shivering mother go to the stove to stir the soup. The ragged gray wool blanket fell to the floor in a heap around her. Meredith set the table, and for a few precious moments there was noise in the room. An approximation of a relationship, at least. "My girls," Dad said, coming into the kitchen. He looked pale and slight, his once wide shoulders whittled down to nothing by weight loss. Moving forward, he put a hand on each woman's shoulder, bringing Meredith and Mom in close. "I love it when we're together for lunch." Mom smiled tightly. "As do I," she said in that clipped, accented voice of hers. "And me," Meredith said. "Good, good." Dad nodded and went to the table. Mom brought a tray of still-warm feta cheese cornbread slices, drizzled with butter, put a piece on each plate, and then brought over bowls of soup. "I walked the orchard this morning," Dad said. Meredith nodded and took a seat beside him. "I guess you noticed the back of Field A." "Yep. That hillside's been giving us some trouble." "I've got Ed and Amanda on it. Don't worry about the harvest." "I wasn't, actually. I was thinking of something else." She sipped her soup. It was rich and delicious. Homemade lamb meatballs in a savory saffron broth with silken egg noodles. If she didn't exercise extreme caution, she'd eat it all and have to run another mile this afternoon. "Oh, yeah?" "I want to change that field to grapes." Meredith slowly lowered her spoon. "Grapes? The Golden Delicious are not our best apple anymore." Before she could interrupt, he held up his hand. I know. We built this place on Golden Delicious, but things change. Hell, it's almost 2001, Meredith. Wine is the new thing. I think we could make ice wine in late harvest at the very least. In these times, Dad? The Asian markets are tightening, and it's costing us a fortune to transport our fruit. Competition is increasing. Hell, our profits were down 12% last year, and this year doesn't look any better. We're barely hanging on. You should listen to your father, Mom said. Oh, please, Mom. You haven't even been inside the warehouse since we updated the cooling system. And when was the last time you even looked at one of the year-end statements? Enough, Dad said with a sigh. I didn't want to start an argument. Meredith stood up. I need to get back to work. Meredith carried her bowl over to the sink, where she washed it. Then she put the leftover soup in a Tupperware container, stored it in the impossibly full refrigerator, and washed the pot. It hit the strainer with a clang that seemed loud in the quiet room. That was delicious, Mom. Thanks. She said a quick goodbye and left the kitchen. In the entryway, she put her coat back on. She was out on the porch, breathing in the sharp, frigid air when her dad came up behind her. You know how she gets in December and January. Winters are hard for her. I know. He pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. You two need to try harder. Meredith couldn't help being hurt by that. She'd heard it from him all her life. Just once she wanted to hear him say that Mom should try harder. I will, she said, completing their little fairy tale as she always did. And she would try. She always did. But she and her mother would never be close. There was just too much water under that bridge. I love you, Dad, she said, kissing his cheek. I love you too, Maridoodle. He grinned. And think about grapes. Maybe I can still be a vintner before I die. She hated jokes like that. Very funny. Turning away, she went to her car and started the engine. Putting the SUV in reverse, she swung around. Through the lacy snow on the windshield, she saw her parents through the living room window. Dad pulled her mother into his arms and kissed her. They began to dance haltingly, although there was probably no music in the house. Her dad didn't need any. He always said he carried love songs in his heart. Meredith drove away from the intimate scene, but the memory of what she'd seen stayed with her. All the rest of the workday, while she analyzed different facets of the operation, looking for ways to maximize profit, and as she sat through endless management and scheduling meetings, she found herself remembering how in love her parents had looked. The truth was, she had never been able to understand how a woman could be capable of passionately adoring her husband while simultaneously despising her children. No, that wasn't right. Mom didn't despise Meredith and Nina. She just didn't care about them. Meredith? She looked up sharply. For a moment there, she'd been so lost in her own life, that she'd forgotten where she was. At her desk, reading an insect report. "Oh, Daisy, I'm sorry. I guess I didn't hear you knock." "I'm going home." "Is it that late already?" Meredith glanced at the clock. It was 6:37. Shit. Dang it, I'm late. Daisy laughed. "You're always staying late." Meredith began organizing her paperwork into neat piles. "Drive safely, Miss Daisy." It was an old joke, but they both smiled. "And remember, Josh from the Apple Commission will be here at 9 for a meeting. We'll need donuts and coffee." "You got it. Good night." Meredith got her desk ready for tomorrow and then headed out. Snow was falling in earnest now, blurring the view through her windshield. The wipers were moving as fast as they could, but it was still difficult to see. Every pair of oncoming headlights momentarily blinded her. Even though she knew this road like the back of her hand, she slowed down and hugged the shoulder. It reminded her of the one and only time she'd tried to teach Maddie to drive in snow. The memory made her smile. "It's snow, Mom, not black ice. I don't have to drive this slow. I could walk home faster." That was Maddie, always in a hurry. At home, Meredith slammed the door shut behind her and hurried into the kitchen. A quick glance at the clock told her she was late. Again. She put her purse on the counter. "Jeff? I'm in here." She followed his voice into the living room. He was at the wet bar they'd installed in the late '80s, making himself a drink. "Sorry I'm late. The snow—" "Yeah," he said. They both knew she'd left late. "Do you want a drink?" "Sure. White wine." She looked at him, not knowing what she even felt. He was as handsome as ever, with dark blonde hair that was only now beginning to gray at the temples, a strong, square jaw, and steel-gray eyes that always seemed to be smiling. He didn't work out and ate like a horse, but he still had one of those wiry, rawhide bodies that never seemed to age. He was dressed in his usual style, faded Levi's jeans and an old Pearl Jam t-shirt. He handed her a glass of wine. "How was your day?" "Dad wants to plant grapes. And Mom was in the winter garden again. She's going to catch pneumonia." "Your mom is colder than any snowfield." For a moment, she felt the years that bound them, all the connections that time had created. He'd formed an opinion of her mother more than 2 decades ago, and nothing had happened to change it. Amen to that. She leaned back against the wall. All at once, the crazy, hectic, hurried pattern of her day, her week, her month, caught up with her, and she closed her eyes. "I got a chapter written today. It's short, only about 7 pages, but I think it's good. I made you a copy." Meredith? Mare? She opened her eyes and found him looking at her. A small frown creased the skin between his eyes, made her wonder if he'd said something important. She tried to recall, but couldn't. Sorry, long day. You're having a lot of those lately. She couldn't tell if there was a hint of accusation in his voice or just a simple honesty. You know what winter is like. And spring. And summer. There was her answer. Accusation. Even last year she would have asked him what was wrong with them. She would have told him how lost she felt in the gray minutiae of her everyday life, and how much she missed the girls. But lately that kind of intimacy felt impossible. She wasn't quite sure how it had happened, or when, but distance seemed to be spreading between them like spilled ink, staining everything. Yeah, I guess. I'm going to the office, he said suddenly, reaching for the jacket he draped over the back of the chair. Now? Why not? She wondered if it was really a question. Did he want her to stop him? To give him a reason to stay? Or did he want to leave? She wasn't sure. And really, she didn't care right now. It would be nice to take a hot bath and have a glass of wine and not have to try to think of what to say over dinner. Even better not to have to cook dinner at all. No reason. Yeah, he said, kissing her on the cheek. That's what I thought. 2. It had taken 2 weeks hiking through the jungle to find the kill. Bugs had alerted them, and the smell of death. Nina stood beside the guide who had led her here. For a terrible instant, she experienced it all. The flies buzzing in the clearing, the maggots that turned the bloody carcass almost white in places, the stillness of the African jungle that meant predators and scavengers were nearby, watching. Then she began to compartmentalize the scene, to see it as a photographer. She pulled out her light meter and ran a quick check. When that was done, she chose one of the 3 cameras hanging from around her neck and focused on the ruined, bloodied body of the mountain gorilla. Click. She stepped around, kept focusing and snapping shots, changing cameras, adjusting lenses, checking the light. Her adrenaline kicked in. It was the only time she ever really felt alive when she was taking pictures. Her eye was her great gift. That, and her ability to separate from what was going on around her. You couldn't have one without the other. To be a great photographer, you had to see first and feel later. She paused long enough to put a little more Vicks under her nose, and then squatted down closer to focus on the severed neck. From somewhere, she heard the sound of vomiting. It was probably the young journalist who had accompanied Nina. She could hardly worry about that now. Click, click. The poachers wanted only the head, hands, and feet. the money items. There were places in the world where a gorilla's hand was an ashtray in some rich asshole's library. Click, click. For the next hour, Nina framed and shot, changing cameras and lenses as often as she needed to, putting used film into canisters and labeling them before tucking them into her pocketed vest. When dusk finally fell, they began the long, hot, slippery trek back down through the jungle. The air was electric with sounds. Bugs, birds, monkeys, and the sky was the color of fresh blood. A tangerine sun played hide-and-seek through the trees. Though they'd all chatted on the way up, the descent was quiet, solemn. The immediate aftermath was always the worst for Nina. It was difficult sometimes to forget what she'd seen. Often, in the middle of the night, the images would return as nightmares and waken her from a dead sleep. More often than she liked to admit, she woke with tears on her cheeks. At the bottom of the mountain, the group came to the small outpost that served as a town in this remote part of Rwanda. There, they climbed into the jeep and drove several hours to the conservation center, where they asked more questions, and she took more photos. Mrs. Nina? She was standing by the center's door, cleaning a lens, when she heard someone say her name. Putting the camera away, she looked up and saw the center's head guide beside her. She smiled as brightly as she could, given how tired she was. "Hello, Mr. Demonsu. I am sorry to bother you when busy things are happening, but we forgot to give you most important phone message. It was from Mrs. Sylvie. She said to tell you to call her." "Thank you." Nina took the bulky satellite phone out of her bag and carried it and all the gear to a clearing in the center of the camp. A quick compass check identified the satellite's direction. She unfolded the dish part of the sat phone, set it on the ground, and pointed it at 60 degrees northeast. Then she hooked the phone up to the dish and turned it on. An LCD panel blinked to orange life, giving her the signal strength. When it looked good, she made the call. "Hey, Sylvie," she said when her editor answered. "I got the poacher photos today. Sick bastards. Give me, 10 days to get them to you?" "You've got 6 days. We're thinking of the cover." The cover. Her two favorite words. Some women like diamonds. She liked the cover of Time magazine. Or National Geographic. She wasn't picky. She actually hoped someday to get the cover and about 16 pages for her photographic essay titled Women Warriors Around the World, her pet project. As soon as she was done, whenever the hell that might be, she'd submit freelance. "You'll have it. And then I'm meeting Danny in Namibia." "Lucky girl. Have sex for me. But be ready to be back to work next Friday. The violence in Sierra Leone is escalating again. The peace talks are going to fall apart. I want you there before Christmas." "You know me," Nina said, "ready to fly at a moment's notice." "I won't call unless a new war breaks out, I promise," Sylvie said. "Now go get laid while I try to remember what it's like." A few days later, Nina was in Namibia, in a rented Land Rover, with Danny at the wheel. It was only 7 in the morning, and already the December sun was bright and warm. By 1 o'clock, the temperature would be somewhere around 115 degrees, and it could well be hotter. The road, if you could call it that, was really a river of thick reddish-gray sand that sucked at the car's tires and sent them careening one way and then the other. Nina held on to the door handle and sat up straight, trying to make her body work like a shock absorber, rolling with the motion. She used her other hand to steady the camera that hung around her neck so that the strap didn't bite into her flesh. A T-shirt was wrapped around the camera and lens. Not a very professional way to battle dust, but in all her years in Africa, it had proven to be the best compromise between protection and use. Here, sometimes you only had an instant to grab your camera and take the shot. No time to fumble with straps and cases. She stared out at the desolate, blistering landscape. As the hours passed, taking them farther and farther from any semblance of civilization, and deeper into one of the last true wildernesses of southern Africa, she noticed more herds of starving animals standing by dry riverbeds. In this summer heat, they were dropping to their knees, dying where they stood as they waited for the rains to come. Bleaching bones lay everywhere. "You sure you want to find the Himba?" Danny asked, flashing her a grin as they slammed sideways and almost found themselves stuck in the sand. The dirt on his face made his white teeth and blue eyes look startlingly bright. Dust powdered his collar-length black hair and shirt. "We haven't had a week to ourselves in months." The so-called road became passable again, and she brought up her camera, studying him through the viewfinder. Focusing on him, widening the shot just a little, she saw him as clearly as if he'd been a stranger. A handsome 39-year-old Irishman with pronounced cheekbones and a nose that had been broken more than once. "Pub fights as a lad," he always said. And just now, when he was looking ahead, concentrating on the road, she could see the tiny frown lines around his mouth. He was worried that he'd followed bad advice on the wrong road, though he'd never say such a thing. He was a war correspondent and used to being in the shit, as he liked to say. Used to following a story to hell and back, even if it wasn't his story. She took the shot. He flashed her a smile, and she took another. "Next time you want to photograph women, I suggest waitresses at a poolside bar." She laughed and put the camera in her lap again, covering the lens with its cap. "I owe you one." "Indeed you do, love. And I'll be collecting, you can be sure." Nina leaned back into the torn, uncomfortable seat and tried not to close her eyes, but she was exhausted. After 2 weeks tracking poachers through the jungle, and 4 weeks before that in Angola watching people kill each other, she was tired to the bone. And still, she loved it. There was nowhere in the world she'd rather be, and nothing she'd rather be doing. Finding the shot was an adrenaline-fueled fun ride, and one she never tired of, no matter what sacrifices she had to make along the way. She'd known that 16 years ago, when at 21, with a journalism degree under her belt and a used camera in her backpack, she'd gone in search of her destiny. For a while, she'd taken any job that required a photographer. But in 1985, she'd gotten her big break. At Live Aid, the concert for famine relief, she'd met Sylvie Porter, then a newbie editor at Time, and Sylvie introduced Nina to a different world. The next thing Nina knew, she was on her way to Ethiopia. What she saw there changed everything. Almost immediately, her pictures stopped being only images and began to tell stories. In 1989, when Typhoon Gay smashed into Thailand, leaving more than 100,000 people homeless, it was Nina's photograph of a single woman up to her chest in dirty water, carrying her crying baby above her head, that graced the cover of Time magazine. 2 years ago, she'd won the Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the famine in Sudan. Not that it came easily, this career of hers. Like the Himba tribe of this region, she'd had to become a nomad. Soft mattresses and clean sheets and running water were luxuries she'd learned to live without. "Look, there," Danny said, pointing. At first, all she saw was an orange and red sky full of dust. The world felt scorched and smelled of smoke. Gradually, the silhouettes on the ridge materialized into thin people, standing tall, gazing down at the dirty Land Rover and its even dirtier occupants. "That them?" he asked. "Must be." Nodding, he closed the last distance between them and the ridge, and at the bend in a dry riverbed, he parked the vehicle and got out. The Himba tribe stood back, watching. Danny walked slowly forward, knowing the chief would present himself. Nina followed his lead. At the elder's hut, they paused. The sacred fire burned in front of it, sending a stream of smoke into the now purple sky. They both bent down, moved carefully, making sure not to pass in front of the fire. That would be seen as disrespectful. The chief approached them, and, in halting Swahili, the three negotiated pictures for money and water. Nina had brought 15 gallons with her for trade. For a people that walked miles for a handful of water, it was an overwhelming gift. And suddenly Nina and Danny were welcomed like old friends. Children surged at them, surrounded Nina in a giggling, jumping pack. The Himbas swept her and Danny into the village, where they were fed a traditional meal of maize porridge and sour milk, and were entertained by the tribe. Later, when the night was blue with moonlight, they were led to a rounded mud hut called a rondoval, where they lay together on a mat of woven grass and leaves. The air smelled sweet, of roasted corn and dry earth. Nina rolled onto her side to face Danny. In the shadowy blue light, his face looked young, although, like her, he had old eyes. It was a hazard of the trade. They'd seen too many terrible things. But it was what had brought them together, what they had in common, the yearning to see everything, no matter how terrible, to know everything. They'd met in an abandoned hut in the Congo during the First War, both of them taking cover from the worst of the fighting. She to reload her camera, him to bandage a wound in his shoulder. "That looks bad," she'd said. "Can I wrap it for you?" He'd looked up at her. "All that praying must have worked. God has sent me my own angel." From then on, they'd been together all over the world. In the Sudan, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Congo, Rwanda, Nepal, Bosnia. They'd both become specialists on Africa. But wherever the big news was happening, they were likely to be there. Both had London apartments that did little more than collect junk mail, messages, and dust. Often their interests took them to separate hot spots. Him to civil wars, her to humanitarian tragedies. And they spent months without seeing each other, which was just fine with Nina. It only made the sex better. "I'm going to be 40 next month," he said quietly. She loved his accent. The simplest sentence sounded edgy and sexy when he said it. "Don't worry. 25-year-olds still swoon when they see you. It's the 'I used to be in a rock band' look of you." "It was a punk rock band, love." She snuggled closer to him, kissed his neck while her hand slid down his bare chest. His body responded as quickly as she expected, and within moments he had her undressed, and they were doing what they'd always done best. Afterward, Danny pulled her close. "How come we can talk about anything but us?" "Who was talking about us?" "I said I was almost 40. "And I'm supposed to see that as a conversation starter?" "I'm 37. "What if I miss you when you're gone?" "You know who I am, Danny. I told you at the very beginning." "That was more than 4 years ago, for God's sake. Everything in the world changes except you, I guess." "Exactly." She rolled over, spooning her body against his. She'd always felt safe in his arms, even when gunfire was exploding all around them and the night was full of screaming. Tonight, though, there was only the sound of a fire crackling outside and of bugs buzzing and chirping in the dark. She moved the tiniest bit away from him, but his arms closed around her, held her in place. "I didn't ask for anything," he whispered into her ear. "You did," she thought, closing her eyes. An unfamiliar anxiety settled in the pit of her stomach. "You just don't know it yet." On a ridge high above the makeshift village, Nina squatted on the crumbling edge of a riverbed. Her thighs burned from the effort it took to remain motionless. It was 6 in the morning, and the sky was a gorgeous blend of aqua and orange. Already the sun was gaining strength. Below her, a Himba woman walked through the village with a heavy pot balanced on her head and a baby positioned in a colorful sling at her breast. Nina raised the camera to her eye and zoomed in the telephoto lens until she could see perfectly. Like all the women of this nomadic African tribe, the young woman was bare-breasted and wore a furry goatskin skirt. A large conch shell necklace, handed down from mother to daughter through the generations, a valued possession, showed the world that she was married, as did the style of her hair. Covered from head to toe in red ochre dust and butterfat to protect her skin from the terrorizing sun, the young mother's skin was the color of old bricks. Her ankles, considered her most private part, were hidden beneath a row of thin metal bands that made a tinkling sound when she walked. Unaware of Nina, the woman paused at the river bank and looked out over the scar on the land where water should run. Her expression sharpened, turned desperate as she reached down to touch the child in her arms. It was a look Nina had seen in women all over the world, especially in times of war and destruction. A bone-deep fear for her child's future. There was nowhere to go to find water. Nina caught it on film and kept shooting until the woman walked on, went back to her rounded mud hut, and sat down in a circle of other women. Together, talking, the women began crushing red ochre on flat rocks, collecting the sandy residue in calabash bowls. Nina covered the lens and stood up, stretching her aching joints. She'd taken hundreds of pictures this morning, but she didn't need to look through them to know that the one was of the woman at the riverbank. In her mind, she cropped, framed, printed, and hung the image among the great ones she'd collected. Someday her portraits would show the world how strong and powerful women could be, as well as the personal cost of that strength. She unloaded the film, labeled the canister, tucked it away, and reloaded. Then walked through the village, smiling at people, handing out the candies and ribbons and bracelets she always carried. She took another great picture of 4 Himba women emerging from the smoke and herb sauna that was their method of keeping clean in a land devoid of water. In the picture, the women were holding hands and laughing. It was an image that captured a universal feminine connection. She heard Danny come up beside her. "Hey, you." She leaned against him, feeling good about her shots. "I just love how they are with their kids, even when the odds are impossible. The only time I cry is when I see their faces with their babies. Why is that, with all we've seen?" "So it's mothers you follow. I thought it was warriors." Nina frowned. She'd never thought of it that way, and the observation was unsettling. Not always mothers. Women fighting for something, triumphing over impossible odds. He smiled. "So you are a romantic after all." She laughed. "Right. You ready to go?" "I think I got what I needed, yeah." "Does this mean we can go lie by a pool for a week?" "There's nothing I'd rather do." She put her camera equipment away and repacked their gear while Danny spoke to the village elder and paid the tribe for the pictures. She set up her satellite phone on the desert floor, unfolding the silver wings and positioning it until she found a signal. As she expected, the magazine offices were closed, so she left a message for her editor and promised a call from the Chobe River Lodge in Zambia. Then she and Danny climbed back into the busted-up old Land Rover, drove through the lunar landscape of Keokavelt, and hopped on a plane headed south. By nightfall, they were at the Chobe River Lodge on their own private deck, watching the sun set over a herd of elephants on the opposite shore. They were being served gin and tonics while 100 yards away, lions were hunting in the tall grass. In a bikini that had seen better days, Nina stretched out on the luxurious two-person lounge chair and closed her eyes. The night smelled of murky water and dry grass and mud baked to stone by the unforgiving sun. For the first time in weeks, her pixie-cut black hair was clean, and there was no red dirt under her fingernails. Pure luxury. She heard Danny coming through their room toward the deck. He took an almost imperceptible pause before each step. A tiny favoring of the right leg, which had taken a bullet in Angola. He pretended it didn't bother him, told people there was no pain. But Nina knew about the pills he swallowed, and the way he sometimes couldn't find a comfortable position in which to sleep. When she massaged his body, she put extra effort into that leg, although he didn't ask her to, and she didn't admit that she'd done it. "Here you go," he said, putting 2 glasses onto the teak table beside her. She tilted her face up to thank him and noticed several things at once. He hadn't brought a gin and tonic. Instead, he'd put down a straight shot so big it was practically a tumbler full of tequila. He'd forgotten the salt, and worst of all, he wasn't smiling. She sat up. "What's wrong?" Maybe you should take a drink first. When an Irishman told you to take a drink first, there was bad news coming. He sat down beside her on the lounger. She eased sideways to make room for him. The stars were out now, and in the pale silvery glow she could see his sharp features and hollow cheeks, his blue eyes and curly hair. She realized in that moment, when he looked so sad, how much he laughed and smiled. Even when the sun was broiling, or the dust was choking, or the gunshots were exploding in the air, he could always smile. Except now he wasn't. He handed her a smallish yellow envelope. Telegram. Did you read it? Course not. But it can't be good news now, can it? Journalists and producers and photojournalists the world over knew about telegrams. It was how your family delivered bad news, even in this satellite phone and internet age. Her hands were unsteady as she reached for the envelope. Her first thought was, thank God, when she saw that it had come from Sylvie. But that relief died as she read on. Nina, your father has had a heart attack. Meredith says it looks bad. Sylvie. She looked up at Danny. It's my dad. I need to go now. Impossible, love, he said gently. The first flight out of here is at 6. I'll get us tickets to Seattle from Johannesburg. Is it best to drive from there? Us? Aye. I want to be there for you, Nina. Is that so terrible? She didn't know how to respond to that, what to say. Relying on people for comfort had never felt natural to her. The last thing she wanted was to give someone the power to hurt her. Self-preservation was the one thing she'd learned from her mother. So she did what she always did at times like these. She reached down for the buttons on his pants. Take me to bed, Daniel Flynn. Get me through this night. Interminable was the word that came to mind to describe the wait. But that only made Meredith think terminal, which made her think death, which brought up all the emotions she was trying to suppress. Her usual coping mechanism, keeping busy, wasn't working for her now, and she'd tried. She'd buried herself in insurance information, researched heart attacks and survival, and come up with a list of the best cardiologists in the country. The second she put her pen down or looked away from the screen, her grief came rushing back. Tears were a constant pressure behind her eyes. So far, though, she'd kept them from falling. Crying would be its own defeat, and she refused to give up. She crossed her arms tightly, staring at the multicolored fish in the waiting room tank. Sometimes, if she was lucky, one of them actually caught her attention, and for a nanosecond she forgot that her father might be dying. She felt Jeff come up behind her. Though she hadn't heard footsteps on the carpet, she knew he was there. "Mare," he said quietly, putting his hands on her shoulders. She knew what he wanted. For her to lean back into him, to let herself be held. There was a part of her that wanted it too, longed for that comfort, in fact. But the larger part of her, the part that was hanging on to hope one breath at a time, didn't dare soften. In his arms, she might fall apart, and what good would that do? "Let me hold you," he said into her ear. She shook her head. How was it that he didn't understand? She worried about her father in a way that consumed her. It felt as if a knife had plunged deep in her chest, tearing past bone and muscle. The sharp point lay poised at her heart. One wrong move, and the tender organ would be punctured. Behind her, she heard him sigh. He let go. "Did you get hold of your sister?" "I left messages everywhere I could. You know Nina. She'll be here when she's here." She looked at the clock again. "What is taking that damn doctor so long? He should be giving us a report. In 10 minutes, I'm calling the head of the department." Jeff started to say something. Honestly, she was barely listening. Her heart was beating so fast she couldn't hear much above it. But before he was finished, the door to the waiting room opened, and Dr. Watanabe appeared. In an instant, Meredith, Jeff, and Mom came together, walked to the doctor. "How is he?" her mother asked in a voice that carried throughout the room. How could she possibly sound so strong at a time like this? Only the heaviness of her accent showed that she was upset. Otherwise, she looked as calm as ever. Dr. Watanabe smiled briefly, barely, and said, "Not good. He had a second heart attack when we were taking him to surgery. We were able to resuscitate him, but he's very weak." "What can you do?" Meredith asked. "Do?" Dr. Watanabe said, frowning. The compassion in his eyes was terrible. "Nothing. The damage to his heart is too extensive. Now we just wait and hope he makes it through the night." Jeff slipped his arm around Meredith's waist. "You can see him if you'd like. He's in the cardiac care unit, but one at a time, okay?" Dr. Watanabe said, taking Mom by the elbow. Details, Meredith thought, watching her mother walk down the hallway. Focus on the details. Find a way to fix this. But she couldn't do it. Memories gathered at the periphery of her vision, waiting to be invited near. She saw her dad in the stands at her high school gymnastic meets, cheering with embarrassing vigor, and at her wedding, weeping openly as he walked her down the aisle. Only last week, he'd taken her aside and said, "Let's go get a couple of beers, Maridoodle, just the two of us, like we used to." And she'd blown him off, told him they'd do it soon. Had it really been so important to drop off the dry cleaning? "I guess we should call the girls," Jeff said. fly them home. On that, Meredith felt something inside her break. And although she knew it was irrational, she hated Jeff for saying it. He'd given up already. Mare? He pulled her into his arms and held her. I love you, he whispered. She stayed in his arms as long as she could bear, and then eased away. Saying nothing, not even looking at him, she followed the path her mother had walked, feeling utterly, dangerously alone in the austere, busy CCU. People in blue scrubs moved in and out of her field of vision, but she had eyes only for her father. He lay in a narrow bed, surrounded by tubes and IV lines and machines. Beside him, her mother stood vigil. Even now, as her husband lay connected to life by the most tenuous strands, she looked strangely, almost defiantly serene. Her posture was perfect, and if there was a shaking in her hands, it would take a seismologist to detect it. Meredith wiped her eyes, unaware until that moment that tears were seeping out. She stood there as long as she could. The doc had said one at a time, and Meredith wasn't one to break rules, but finally she couldn't stand it. She went to him, stopped at the foot of his bed. The whir of machinery seemed absurdly loud. How is he? Her mother sighed heavily and walked away. Meredith knew her mom would head straight for a window somewhere and stare out into the snowy night, alone. Normally, it pissed Meredith off, how alone her mother liked to be. But just now she didn't care, and for once she didn't judge her mother harshly. Everyone broke and held themselves together in their own way. She reached down and touched her father's hand. Hey, Daddy, she whispered, trying her best to smile. It's your Maradoodle. I'm here, and I love you. Talk to me, Daddy. The only answer was the wind, tapping on the glass while the snow flurried and danced beneath the outside light. 3.